On May 21st, 2026, Tennessee attempted to execute Tony Carruthers by lethal injection. But before the state could administer the lethal drugs, the process reportedly broke down during the attempt to establish IV access. And this case made me think about a bigger question. What does lethal injection look like when we stop focusing only on the moment of death and start looking at everything the state has to do to get there? Welcome to ACAB True Crime. I have over a decade of clinical training and experience in psychology, including work and training in forensic and correctional settings. Here on this channel, we explore true crime, systems of power, and the human stories behind them through psychological and systemic analysis. So let me show you how this played out in a real case. Tony Carruthers is a 57-year-old black man on Tennessee's death row, and he was sentenced to death in 1994 for a triple homicide in Memphis involving Delois Anderson, Marcellus Anderson, and Frederick Tucker. There are major contested issues in this case, and I'll just give you a little brief overview of those, but I won't go down the entire, this could all be its own video, to be honest. But a few of them that have come up since 1994 include representation problems, co-defendant issues. Actually, his co-defendant, they were tried together, so the two of them that were found guilty for this in 1994 and put on death row, but his co-defendant went through the appeal process, and he ended up getting granted a new trial because they found that he shouldn't have had a co-defendant. It was found that they shouldn't have been co-defendants with one another, but they only found that on the appeal with Tony Carruthers' co-defendant. So instead of going through a whole new trial, his co-defendant ended up taking a plea deal and getting out in 2015. And Tony Carruthers has stayed on death row the whole time, even though it's the same issue with the co-defendants. And there is also other issues like recanted or disputed forensic claims, untested evidence claims, major witness problems, and serious mental illness arguments. And cases like this raise another uncomfortable question. If the legal process itself remains deeply contested decades later, what does it mean to give the state irreversible power over life and death? Since 1973, at least 202 people have been exonerated from death row in the United States. Researchers estimate that more than 4% of people sentenced to death may be innocent. And because execution is irreversible, we may never know how many innocent people have already been put to death. Even though some standards exist, defendants facing the death penalty, especially those who are poor, often still receive inadequate representation. Public defenders juggle huge caseloads, leaving capital defendants without truly experienced defense. And that doesn't even scratch the surface of who gets targeted, because when we look at who ends up on death row, racial bias is undeniable. One glaring disparity is that black defendants are more likely to be sentenced to death, especially if the victim is white. Data shows that cases involving white victims disproportionately result in capital punishment. Additionally, systemic bias means black defendants are more likely to be wrongfully convicted and later exonerated. Bottom line, racial bias and class inequality in the system leads to both harsher punishments and more errors when it comes to death row. So on May 21st, 2026, a couple of weeks ago, Tennessee attempted to execute Carruthers by lethal injection. The public and media is not usually allowed to see the IV setting process of lethal injection, so we can only get that information from either the offender's lawyer or the executioners themselves. Lethal injection looks simple from the outside. You insert the IV, administer the drugs, and then the death happens. But the entire process depends on finding and maintaining reliable venous access. That is not guaranteed, especially in people who are older, medically complex, dehydrated, chronically ill, or have vascular issues. We know compared to the general population, prison populations have higher rates of chronic illness, disability, infectious disease, substance use history, and mental health conditions. And we know long-term incarceration also accelerates aging. And prison itself can worsen health through stress, trauma, poor sleep, limited movement, poor nutrition, heat, delayed medical care, and inconsistent treatment, to name a few things. That doesn't mean that every person on death row has poor veins, but it does mean that the state is depending on a medical process that can for sure fail. And Carruthers is not the only example. In fact, actually, between 1890 and 2010, in the US, 3.15% of executions were botched. And just a little trigger warning here, if you don't like hearing stories of botched executions, I'm going to be speaking about a few right here. So while doing my research, these were a couple of examples that stood out to me and I thought were a good sampling of examples. In 1879, Wallace Wilkerson was executed by firing squad in Utah. He reportedly refused a blindfold and was not properly restrained. And the firing squad missed his heart and he took a prolonged time to die. So even a method people sometimes describe as simple or straightforward was not necessarily clean and easy or quick. In 1901, Tom Blackjack Ketchum was hanged in New Mexico Territory. His hanging is one of the most infamous botched hangings in U.S. history because the rope and drop were miscalculated and he was decapitated. In 1983, Jimmy Lee Gray was executed in Mississippi's gas chamber. Witnesses reported that he gasped, moaned, and hit his head against the metal pole behind the chair before officials cleared the witness room. Also in 1983, John Evans was electrocuted in Alabama. He was electrocuted multiple times over roughly 14 minutes before death was pronounced, and witnesses reported smoke and flames from his body. And that wasn't the only report of something like that happening to people who were being electrocuted. Then in 2014, Clayton Lockett's lethal injection in Oklahoma became one of the best known modern botched executions. Staff struggled to find a vein, eventually placed the IV in his groin area, and then the line failed. Lockett moved, groaned, and tried to speak before the execution was stopped. He later died. It was noted that the IV was improperly placed and that the drugs did not work as intended in an investigation afterwards. A new solution to botched lethal injections being presented recently is nitrogen hypoxia. But witnesses have already begun describing visible distress, struggling, gasping, and prolonged execution with this method. But every time, the same question comes back. Is the method actually humane, or is it just easier for the public to look at? So, if every execution method gets sold as the cleaner solution to the last one, lethal injection is probably the clearest version of that pattern. Because lethal injection does not just promise a cleaner death, it borrows the appearance of medicine. There is a gurney, there are IV lines, there are drugs, there are protocols, there may be people in scrubs. The whole thing is arranged to look clinical, controlled, and almost therapeutic. But killing is not medical care, and that is one of the central contradictions exposed by what happened to Tony Carruthers. The doctor involved in Carruthers' execution actually referred to him as a patient. But this is not treatment, it is not care, this is not medicine being used to heal someone, relieve suffering, or preserve life. This is medicine's language and tools being used in an attempted execution. The state wants the authority of medicine without the ethics of medicine. Medicine derives its legitimacy from reducing suffering and preserving life. Executions ask medicine to participate in the opposite project. The contradiction isn't accidental, it's structural. It will keep reappearing no matter which state, which drugs, which doctor, or which protocol is being used because the death penalty is trying to borrow the legitimacy of a profession whose ethical foundation runs in the opposite direction. And then there's the drug problem. The drugs used in lethal injection have also become harder for states to obtain, partly because drug manufacturers and European regulators have objected to their products being used in executions. So states have had to turn to different drug combinations, new protocols, secrecy laws, and other workarounds. So when people imagine lethal injection as this clean, standardized medical procedure, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a process where the state is trying to borrow the image of medicine while working around medical ethics, drug manufacturers, public scrutiny, and sometimes even basic anatomy. And that secrecy matters because public support for lethal injection depends, at least partly, on the image people have in their heads. Most people support lethal injection in the abstract, but support often declines when people are exposed to the realities of how executions actually occur. The sanitized image matters because it allows the violence itself to remain psychologically distanced or detached. Most people do not picture the state searching for someone's feet or veins. They don't picture a doctor asking random people if they can access the jugular vein. They do not picture a central line attempt in the chest area. They don't picture someone bleeding, trembling, sweating, and visibly distressed on a gurney before before the drugs are even administered, and that is what the Carruthers case exposes. The problem did not start when the lethal drugs went in. In his case, the state reportedly could not even reliably get to that point. So the question is not just whether Tennessee messed up. The question is whether execution can ever truly be humane when it depends so heavily on keeping the public from seeing what actually has to happen. The lesson of Tony Carruthers' case is not simply that Tennessee failed to carry out an execution properly. The lesson is that every generation keeps searching for a cleaner, more humane, and more civilized way to execute people, and every generation eventually confronts the same reality. Hanging, electrocution, gas chambers, firing squads, lethal injection, and now nitrogen hypoxia have all been presented as solutions, yet the suffering, secrecy, and contradictions remain. And even if an execution method worked exactly as intended, it would not resolve the deeper questions that surround the death penalty: wrongful convictions, racial disparities, unequal legal representation, serious mental illnesses, and the irreversible power of the state to decide who lives and who dies. Perhaps the problem is not that some executions are botched. Perhaps the problem is that the very idea of a humane execution is a contradiction. Maybe the point is not that people would automatically oppose executions if they saw everything required to carry them out. Maybe the point is that the hidden process exposes the contradiction at the center of the death penalty. There is no clean, clinical, or humane way to use medicine, law, and state power to kill a human being. Thank you all so much for being here and supporting my channel. If you have not subscribed, please subscribe. It's free to do and it would be very helpful to me and this channel. And if you like this video, please like the video. Alright, peace and love. ACAB out. Bye-bye.